This move initiates the reti opening, a flexible system aiming to control the center from the flanks rather than occupying it directly. With pawns, allowing white to delay committing their central pawn structure. This move develops a knight towards the center, mirroring white's first move and maintaining flexibility in developing black's other pieces. Typical of several Indian defenses. This move introduces an English opening structure, aiming to control central squares and create imbalances by challenging black's knight control and preparing potential pawn advances. By playing g6, black initiates a King's Indian or Grunfeld setup, intending to fianchetto the bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal and prepare for a kingside fianchetto. Developing the kingside bishop to g2 fianchetto prepares to control the long diagonal and supports a potential queenside pawn expansion. This move develops the bishop to its most active diagonal, aiming towards the center and preparing to castle kingside, typical of the King's Indian defense setup. This move develops the bishop to a powerful attacking diagonal, solidifying white's control over the center and preparing for kingside castling in a King's Indian setup. Castling on the kingside completes king safety and prepares to connect the rooks for future central action, a standard developing move in this King's Indian setup. This move establishes a strong central pawn presence, aiming to control key squares and prepare for further development, aligning with typical King's Indian defense setups. This move solidifies black's pawn center, aiming to establish a classical pawn triangle and prepare for d5, a common theme in King's Indian structures. This move develops another minor piece towards the center and supports a potential central pawn push, aligning with a common setup in many King's Indian setups. Black strikes boldly in the center with d5, challenging white's control and aiming to open lines for their pieces, a typical response in many King's Indian setups. This pawn capture opens the c-file, aiming to challenge black's central pawn control and potentially develop pressure along that important vertical. This recapture opens the c-file for white's rook and creates an isolated d-pawn for black, requiring careful defensive play. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially challenge the d5 pawn. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure, preparing to develop the queenside pieces and potentially challenge white's knight on e5. This move, castling kingside, secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a vital step in developing white's queenside pieces. This move, 9, nfd7, is a common and logical response in many variations of the Queen's Indian and Catalan systems, aiming to support the central pawn push with nxc3 followed by nxe5, or to reroute the knight to f6 or c5 to challenge white's central control and improve piece placement. This move initiates a strategic pawn thrust aimed at controlling the center and developing attacking potential on the kingside, characteristic of lines found in the King's Indian attack or similar setups against black's fianchettoed bishop. This move re-establishes the knight's central influence, preparing to challenge white's strong na5 and potentially support a future nxe5 exchange to ease defensive pressure. This move develops the bishop to a central square, supporting the knight on e5 and preparing to control key diagonals. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority by rerouting the knight to a more active square and potentially supporting a pawn break later. This move initiates a typical plan in this type of structure, preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b2 where it will support the central pawns and the kingside. This move prepares to exchange the bishop for white's knight on e5, aiming to resolve the tension in the center and potentially open lines for black's pieces. qd2 prepares to connect the rooks and supports a potential kingside pawn advance with f5, aiming to exploit white's central space advantage. This move 13 f6 challenges white's centralized knight on e5, aiming to improve black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for piece activity. A common theme in structures arising from the king's Indian defense or similar setups. This knight retreat prepares to redeploy to a more active square, potentially on c5 or e5, while also supporting the advance of the f-pawn and reinforcing the queenside structure. This knight retreat to c8, while seemingly passive, aims to reinforce the queenside and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square like e7 or d6 after further pawn advances. This move activates the rook on the c-file, preparing to contest the open file and support potential pawn breaks or piece activity on the queenside. This move repositions the knight from the edge of the board to a more central square, preparing to challenge white's control over d4 and potentially support a kingside pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the queenside diagonal, aiming to support the pawn push e2 e4 or to influence the queenside majority. This move fundamentally alters the pawn structure, aiming to gain central space and potentially open lines for white's pieces. But it also weakens the dark squares around black's king. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, directly challenging black's central pawn and preparing to support a potential kingside attack. This move prepares to connect the rooks and potentially support a central pawn push or reinforce the queenside. This prophylactic move clears the first rank, allowing the rook to potentially move to c1 and enabling a kingside pawn advance later should the opportunity arise. This move advances the rook to an open file, activating it and potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file for future play. This aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside aims to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and create attacking chances by opening lines. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, supporting pawn breaks and potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the d5 square. This move exchanges knight for knight, aiming to simplify the position and remove a potentially active defender, opening lines for white's pieces. This pawn capture opens the f-file for black's rook and challenges white's central pawn structure, potentially leading to a dynamic middle game fight. By exchanging the knight for the bishop, white opens the d-file for potential pressure and simplifies the position, aiming to exploit black's slightly less harmonious pawn structure. This move recaptures the knight, stabilizing the center and preparing to contest the open c-file while allowing black to potentially activate their queen. This move prepares to control the b4 square and potentially create a queenside pawn majority while supporting the knight on c3. Black's move a5 aims to prevent white's queenside expansion with b4 and simultaneously prepares to challenge the queenside pawn structure. The move 23, bh3 aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the black kingside and potentially creating threats against the pawn on f5 or the knight on d6, while also preparing to challenge black's light-squared bishop. The queen repositions to e7, preparing to contest the d-file and offering support to the potential advance of the e-pawn. White prepares to double rooks on the c-file, aiming to exploit the open file and create pressure against black's queenside. This move, nd8, prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active square, likely c6. to contest the center and support the pawn push e5. This pawn advance aims to break open the kingside, creating attacking chances by opening files and potentially creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This move solidifies black's kingside pawn structure, creating a defensive barrier against white's aggressive pawn push, though it does weaken the light squares around the king. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it can influence the d6 pawn and potentially support a kingside pawn advance, while also defending against black's potential breakthroughs. The knight repositions to c6, seeking to reactivate its central influence and potentially support a future e5 push or reinforce the queenside defense. This move solidifies white's kingside pawn structure and prepares to reinforce the e3h6 diagonal for the bishop, aiming to control central squares and potentially initiate pawn breaks later. This move develops the rook to a more central and active file, preparing to contest control of the open d file and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. This pawn capture opens the f file and challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses and create attacking chances on the kingside. This recapture opens the e file and centralizes the queen, preparing for potential pawn advances and piece activity, while also challenging white's initiative. This move prepares to activate the rook on the f file, aiming to create attacking chances on the kingside or potentially exploit an open f file if black's f6 pawn advances further. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the f file and potentially create counterplay by opening lines for black's pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the potential pawn push on the kingside and preparing to coordinate with the rooks on the open c file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the central open files and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or reinforce the kingside defense. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to challenge the central file and potentially support a kingside attack or reinforce the queenside defense as black's pieces are somewhat passively placed. This move places the rook on the open c file, a crucial strategic asset, aiming to increase pressure on white's queenside and potentially support an advance of the d pawn. Rack 1 activates the rook on the open c file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially create threats on the queenside. This move aims to consolidate the rook on the c file, potentially supporting a future push of the c pawn or preparing to double rooks, while also creating a defensive outpost on the semi-open c file. This move exchanges the rooks on the c file, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit the now open d file for the queenside. Majority. Black recaptures the piece, maintaining material equality and preparing to contest the open c file with the rook. This move aims to secure the b pawn from potential threats and prepares to advance the a pawn, aiming to gain queenside space and restrict black's pieces. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to contest the open c file and potentially support counterplay on the queenside. This move aims to reinforce the light squares around the king and prepare to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal if the opportunity arises. This knight repositions to the c8 square, aiming to escape the queenside pressure and potentially join the kingside defense or exploit the open c file in future exchanges, while also preparing to potentially challenge white's advanced pawn on b3. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting a potential breakthrough on the kingside and preparing to contest the open c file. This move prepares to recapture the b3 pawn with the queen after white's qb2 moves, while also potentially repositioning the queen to a more active square on the kingside if the opportunity arises. This move activates the bishop, preparing to support a potential queenside advance or contest the central squares more effectively. This move correctly develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn advance later. The bishop repositions to e1 to prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also potentially freeing the d-file for the rook and aiming to influence the d6 pawn. The knight repositions to e7 to defend the weakened c6 square and potentially support a future kingside advance or a central pawn break with e5. This move repositions the rook to the open c-file, contesting control and preparing to exert pressure on black's queenside pawns if they become vulnerable. This move repositions the rook to the f-file, aiming to contest control of the open file and potentially support pawn advances or create tactical threats against white's kingside. The king's move to g2 aims to secure the monarch from any potential threats along the central files or diagonals, while also preparing for a future pawn push on the kingside or simply repositioning for better defense. The knight's repositioning to g6 aims to support a potential kingside pawn advance or to contest the dark squares around the white king. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to create space and potential weaknesses for black by advancing the b-pawn. This move aims to prevent white from opening lines on the queenside with moves like b5, further solidifying black's queenside pawn structure. This move seeks to activate the queen on a more central square, aiming to coordinate with the rook on the c-file and potentially exploit the weakened b4 pawn structure of black. This move redirects the queen to a more active square where it can pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially support a kingside advance, while also being less vulnerable to counterplay. The move is a repositioning of the queen to a more active central square, allowing it to support potential pawn advances on the kingside and control key diagonals. This move shifts the king to a slightly safer square, preparing to support the rook's defense of the g6 pawn and to potentially activate the king later. In the endgame, the rook reroutes to c3 to prepare a potential advance along the third rank, aiming to support the pawn majority on the queenside and contest control of the c-file. Black initiates a bold pawn storm on the kingside, seeking to create counterplay and disrupt white's queenside space advantage. This capture opens the g-file, creating attacking chances against black's king and challenging the f5 pawn, which is currently defended by black's king. This move initiates a critical tactical sequence by forking white's king and rook, forcing a difficult decision and potentially opening lines for black's pieces to become more active. This capture on h4 is a critical decision, opening lines and potentially simplifying the position, which could favor white if the resulting endgame is favorable for the bishop pair. The capture of the pawn is necessary to avoid the knight's fork on the queen and rook, but it opens the g-file, creating new attacking possibilities for white's rook and queen against black's king. The queen repositions to a more active square, potentially preparing to support a pawn advance on the kingside or contest the open files that have emerged. This move exploits the weakened dark squares around white's king, creating an immediate tactical threat that white must address with great care. The immediate threat is black's rook on the h-file, forcing the king to relocate to safety and centralize, which also frees up the g2 bishop to participate in the defense. This move allows black to double their queenside pawns, reinforcing the a-pawn and potentially creating pressure on white's queenside defenses while preparing to challenge the open c-file. The capture on f2 is a necessary liquidation of material, forcing the exchange of queens and heading towards an endgame where white's central pawn majority on the queenside may prove advantageous. The exchange of queens has led to an endgame where black's king is exposed on the kingside, creating an immediate advantage for white due to the open g-file and potential for pawn breakthroughs. This rook move aims to contest the open c-file, which is crucial for controlling the center and potentially creating weaknesses for black's king. This move is a decisive sacrifice aiming to use the pawn on h3 to exploit the weakened king position and win material after the subsequent recapture. This move consolidates the king's position, preparing to bring the rook into the endgame and potentially support a central pawn push or defend against black's counterplay. This move is a desperate check from black's rook to try and force a draw by perpetual check against the exposed white king, as white is up a rook and should be able to escape the checks. This move is a necessary king repositioning after the forced sequence, aiming to escape the immediate checks and prepare for the rook's potential advance or defense. This endgame features a material imbalance, with black having 2 pawns for the sacrificed knight, and white must carefully defend against black's active king and potential passed pawns. The king is forced into a perpetual check sequence, aiming to escape the immediate mating threats while the opponent's queen hunts for decisive blows. Black offers the bishop to create a mating threat on the kingside after the white king is drawn out, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure. The king is forced back to the starting square after the sacrifice, repositioning for potential defense in the endgame as the opponent's bishop controls the critical squares. This move allows black to reposition their king to a safer square, away from the open g-file and potential checks from white's rook and queen, while preparing to defend the g-pawn. The game has simplified to an endgame where white's king is actively participating in the defense of the h4 pawn and is positioning itself to support potential king activity on the kingside. The king seeks safety on the kingside, aiming to avoid further pawn advances and prepare to regroup its pieces for a defensive posture. This move repositions the king to safety on the h-file, as the pawn chain on the kingside has been broken by black's aggressive pawn push and subsequent capture. This move initiates a critical checkmate sequence, forcing the opposing king into a desperate position and aiming to deliver a swift conclusion to the game. This move is a critical attempt to escape the perpetual check initiated by black's rook, but white's king remains vulnerable to further checks and potential mating attacks. The move aims to force an exchange of rooks on the f-file, which could simplify the position and potentially lead to a draw by repetition or simplify into a drawn endgame. The player is aiming to repeat the position with their king, as all other moves lead to a loss of material due to the hanging pawn on h3 and the threatened bishop. This move aims to solidify the bishop's position on a more active diagonal and potentially challenge white's queenside control, a logical attempt to create counterplay in a symmetrical and somewhat drawn-out position. The position has been simplified considerably, and black's bishop on g3 is now somewhat passively placed. White's king must return to g1 to avoid further checks and consolidate its position. Black's king continues its desperate king hunt, forcing the white king to repeatedly move and preventing any potential promotion threats from the pawn on h3. This move aims to reposition the king to a more active and safer square, preparing to support the remaining pawns while avoiding potential checks or tactical threats from black's pieces. Black intends to reposition the rook to the e-file, aiming to create threats against White's king and potentially exploit the open file that may arise after White's knight retreats. This move repositions the rook to the central file, preparing to contest control of the open c-file and potentially support further pawn advances or engage Black's remaining forces. The rook reroutes to g3, aiming to support the advance of the g-pawn or potentially create threats on the third rank while also unpinning the bishop.